enterprise IT landscape, we have classic enterprise applications which are hosted in our on-premise data centers, which are obviously secured, maybe using my Active Directory, maybe using the on-prem resources that we have. By every passing day, we have added additional layers of security with, you can say, mobile application management, mobile device management, endpoint security solutions, etc. When we are actually deploying this kind of an environment, there will be multiple challenges that any organization would face. And to adapt and overcome these challenges, we have the identity solution now coming from the cloud. Why coming from the cloud? For a reason that today you are not only accessing classic enterprise applications, but you also have access to publicly available enterprise applications. Some of them, like your Office 365 or your Google Drive, or you can say maybe your Dropbox, or any kind of a storage or any kind of a social networking platform where you are trying to build some or the other productivity. The enterprise identity management solution in cloud that you have has got the one big advantage, which is the next level of mobile experience. Now, why are we highlighting this next level of mobile experience? The reason is that today, more than our laptops and desktops, our mobile devices are the ones on which we are counting for productivity. So when I say on the mobile devices, I'm counting for productivity, it means my mails, my Teams meetings, my OneDrive storage, all of it is something that is being accessed from mobile. So it becomes really important for us to make sure that the identity is 100% secured, who is getting the access to those mobile devices. You have multiple technologies coming in the flow. That is, you have your infrastructure as a service that is hosting your virtual machines on a cloud platform. You have different database and platform as a service components that are in use today, and the ever transitioning digital culture, which is now taking us towards IoT, wherein we have devices and every single aspect which can be IP enabled and connected is also something which will require identity, authentication, authorization, accounting, and other such features. So, for example, today, modern authentication, when we talk about, it covers aspects as in, if I bring my, maybe you can say my Apple Watch close to my laptop, or if I get my any other smartwatch or a smart wrist wearable device to my closer to my laptop should be able to authenticate me and grant me the access, without entering the password. So, when we talk about the enterprise transformation, today sky is the limit because we have, you can say, a big pipeline of technology portfolios which we need to explore. And when we explore all of them, we need to make sure that all our devices, all our users, all our customer data is being accessed safely and securely and not being leaked by the end customer or the end user or the end auditor, whoever is accessing those data and those resources. As I mentioned, identity becomes the control plane, and that is the reason why modern authentication is something that matters the most. When I say modern authentication, we have a list of options that are being offered by the most versatile cloud identity platform, which is Azure Active Directory. You have multiple layers of authentication that can be deployed. You have conditional access, wherein you can define conditions basis which the authentication would work. You have multi-factor authentication, you have OAuth, SAML, and other authentication access, which can actually authenticate anywhere, even beyond the Microsoft platform. Now, when we talk about these kind of aspects in Azure Active Directory, it is good to know that using my Azure Active Directory, I can even authenticate my on-prem resources, my on-prem data, my on-prem applications, everything. Plus, we would have the cloud solutions that can be authenticated. Now, when I say cloud solutions, it's precisely the public cloud that I'm talking about, apart from Microsoft Azure. Active Directory being the identity solution in Azure itself, it is definitely going to drive your authentication across your on-prem and Azure. But it also has the potential to connect other third-party cloud providers, like connecting your Google Apps, connecting your Box storage account, connecting Dropbox services, connecting authentication. You can have connected authentication on Oracle, on IBM, depending upon your requirement, every platform that you would want to collaborate with Azure Active Directory. And lastly, the authentication is not limited only to Windows devices. It also is extended to your Apple devices and your Android devices. It is not limited to users inside your organization. You can authenticate users as guests from a Gmail, Hotmail, Yahoo platform, or maybe you can authenticate users trying to access using their social media account on Azure Active Directory. So that also is possible using the online federation gateway services. So, as I said, online federation services, you can have them authenticated using your ping identity, social media, or any other cloud identity platform. Even may that be not based on Windows and may it be based on a Linux-based LDAP solution. The modern identity journey takes you across multiple checkpoints, wherein it is not only going to, proceed from making you completely, authenticate on all the applications using a single sign-on, but also taking you to an extent where your authentication would completely go passwordless. That is, may that be on a biometric or may that be on a mobile authentication, maybe using your any kind of an authenticator app, the Google Authenticator or the Microsoft Authenticator, depends how you actually want to have the solution implemented inside your ID landscape. The modern identity solution that we have goes across through multiple layers. When you talk about on-premises, it is connecting your on-prem resources with the cloud environment and amalgamating the same using privileged access management and identity management. Whereas when we talk about the secure hybrid identity solution, we are not only implementing privileged access, but also implementing strong authentication and access control using different methods which are never possible easily in your on-premise. So basically, it's like if I ask you to establish a multi-factor authentication service or a biometric authentication service in your on-premise, it's going to be a kind of a nightmare. You have to deploy an ADFS server, you will require a multi-factor authentication server, and a lot more. Going to the cloud, it's as good as just making clicks, nothing more than that. So it is extremely important to make sure that your authentication or your identity or the user journey, let me call it as the user journey, because it's ultimately the end user who is going to, uh, you know, uh, um, experience these kind of changes in the way he used to authenticate on his service. So the entire user journey should connect from your on-prem to the Azure environment. And this is going to then get you the latest modes of authentication implemented in order to make sure that your data is never breached, your identity is always secured. You will have five major parameters or five major milestones, I would say, to achieve. As a best practice of modern authentication, you will make sure that MFA is enabled on all your user devices, on all your user accounts. You will have to block access of unwanted, unauthorized USB devices on your user laptops. You will have to automate the visibility to the vulnerabilities inside your environment and to the kind of notifications and alerts that you would get for any kind of a threat. You will have to increase your awareness with auditing and monitoring security alerts and enable self-help for more predictable and complete end user security. When I say self-help, over here, I'm simply talking about making the user aware of how he should not be leaking out his credentials. Uh, when I say self-help, I'm talking about allowing the users to set the password on their own with the best possible complexity that they can, and other such options. Azure Active Directory is was rather expected to release something in 2020 second half, but it is something which has not yet been completely available. It's still in the development phase, which is the implementation of Azure Active Directory with a cloud HR solution, wherein you can have a complete end user information management system implemented with Azure Active Directory for users, irrespective of on-premise, irrespective of cloud, irrespective of any cloud platform. Azure Active Directory is in today's date working with an excellent solution allowing you to synchronize multiple spanned Active Directory forests to a single Azure Active Directory tenant. That is really amazing. So if I have four organizations that have collaborated with each other, and I need to merge all the four identity or Active Directory solutions to one single Azure Active Directory tenant, well, this is achievable, and this is much easily achievable in Azure just using the Azure AD Connect, which can span across multiple forests. You have fundamentals of Azure Active Directory password protection, where you will yourself define what kind of passwords would you wish to allow and what kind of password would you wish to block. For example, I can actually ban some custom password list in Azure Active Directory in order to make sure that the user should not be using those kind of passwords. And this count can be up to a blocking of 1,000 such passwords, and not allowing the users to access them at all. Password free access to your applications. This is something that Microsoft and other cloud providers have been doing absolutely seriously. When we talk about on your Windows devices, it is your Windows Hello for Business as an application which is going to run. Windows Hello for Business allows you to have your authentication platform as secure as on your mobile device. Reason being, it is uh, you know giving you the opportunity to configure your iris scanners, your fingerprint scanners, and a lot more. You have Microsoft Authenticator as an application on your mobile devices, which will be giving you notifications now and then whenever you try to authenticate on some non-familiar device on a non-familiar location. And then, lastly, what you can have is security hardware tokens. May that be using a FIDO key, or may that be using a smart card, or may that be using any other kind of a biometric solution. So, in today's date, I would say that password free access to your applications is much easier than we ever expected it to be. It leverages you with the aspects of conditional access. Conditional access, to explain you in a very simple language, is something where you define certain conditions based on which your user will be authenticating. So in that case, I can have multiple layers. The first layer can define as to where is the identity going to come from. Will the user come from Azure Active Directory? Will the user come from any online Microsoft service or a Google ID or using ADFS as a component? That is where I'm talking about the identity coming from. Once the identity has been discovered, the next layer of understanding is going to be where is the identity coming from? meaning the type of device from where it is coming. So the first component to discover the identity is who. The second is where. So when I say where, so it is going to be either my Android device, iOS, Mac, or Windows devices, or any other such device which is trusted and which is compliant for my organization to share the access to the data and the resources. The third would be the typical physical location or the location from where the user is accessing. So is the user accessing the resources from within the organization or outside the organization? If from outside the organization, then is the location known or is it an unknown location? And then lastly, whether it is an installed application on that user's device or is it some browser-based access to that application? When we have these four components defined, meaning who, on what type of device, where, and what kind of an application, these conditions become the baseline for the policy that you might set up. The policies can be something where you can actually allow or deny an access to that application, or you can say require a multi-factor authentication for that application, or simply block the user from accessing that particular application, or maybe ask the user to reset the password, or do not allow the kind of authentication method that the user might be using. So conditional access revolves around a lot of parameters which you select, and based on that the user will be granted access to the application or the service. You have another fundamental which is called as privileged access. And before jumping to privileged access, we need to understand what kind of risks are associated with the same. When we talk about privileged access, it becomes really important for us to identify which user requires what level of administrative rights in our environment. Depending upon the level of rights that are required, I can segregate the permissions to make sure that only your defined user roles have the access to perform the necessary change, and other users have absolutely got no access to the environment. Identity protection that we had in 2019 had got some really good number of statistics of compromised users, of malicious sign-in attempts that were done by attackers from different places, and high-risk sign-ins that were detected on users from a production environment. The numbers are seriously high. Looking at this number, the identity and access management solution was completely revisited and a new layer of security was added in 2020. The new layer of security first tried to identify which kind of a user is at risk. If the user is probably logging in from a location which is unfamiliar for us, which is probably the first time that an IP address is detected requesting an authentication for the user, or maybe it is coming from an IP address which is spoofed and has been continuously tossed around to come from a different location altogether. Next would be an Active Directory based identity which performs an activity on any cloud application after signing in, and that activity is monitored as suspicious. So maybe try to share some file unauthorized from OneDrive, try to share some data from your SharePoint without having the relevant permissions, having block notifications coming up again and again, etc. And the third component to identify the user risk status was whether the user credentials are known to be compromised or not, meaning has the password been repeatedly used, or is it an easy password, or is it not as per the policy. However, all of this is identified using the typical machine learning platform that Azure Active Directory continuously runs in the backend. We then had a risk detection engine being built. This risk detection engine first identifies the user on the Azure Active Directory. Once the user is identified, we, before authenticating the same, try to figure out whether it was a familiar sign-in or an unfamiliar sign-in. If it is an unfamiliar sign-in, it will either block my access or ask me to enter the multi-factor authentication credentials. Offline detections is also something which will be running with Azure Active Directory, which tries to identify the hop counts, as I said, of the IP addresses and the compromised IP address from where the user's identity request is actually originating. And then, after the validation of both these tasks, it is that the user will get the access to the cloud application or the cloud data. Detections on these activities can be monitored using MCAS. MCAS is something known as the Microsoft Cloud Application Security. I'm sure you guys might be aware it is the topmost product of the Microsoft 365 E5 suite, and it has been having that potential to capture exponential data from all your applications like no other suite, making it one single common dashboard to evaluate every single activity happening inside your cloud environment. May that be Microsoft Cloud or may that be any other third party cloud solution. Moving further, the user, once is authenticated, will also be granted a notification about the activity that has been performed, meaning whether it was blocked or whether it was required to enter an MFA, a reason stating why some information like this has been demanded. And then the user registers for the MFA component, and next time onwards that the user tries to log in, every component of that user will be monitored using the Azure AD Threat Intelligence Service. Every single activity which will be detected inside your Azure Active Directory about the user, every single IP that might be traced, every single Microsoft Cloud Application Security based notification that will come up, every you can say behavior that the user is going to have will become the baseline to identify the risks that can come in your environment. So when we say that Azure Active Directory will have a machine learning logic in the backend, it is basically based on nothing else except for the trends inside your own environment. And based on that, it will give you some forecasted recommendations on the Azure security portal, and that should become the next pipeline for you to execute in your environment. You get notifications like these stating that user at risk is detected. Only the necessary admin will be notified about this kind of an issue, and basis that the user remediation tasks needs to be performed. You will be able to have a quick look at all the identity activities that are happening in the Azure environment. It will give you a real-time statistical data, which is going to be really interesting for you to understand, so that you know every single notification that you see should be able to give you a best practice to be implemented in your environment. The users will get notifications. So this is basically from the administrative front, and from the end users front, you will get notifications stating you cannot access this right now because you don't have the permissions to do so, or maybe your request was denied for a reason that the authentication approver did not approve the request, etc. Identity protection with Azure AD will give you the modern user interface for viewing risk across users, sign-ins and detections. Everything will be systematically categorized. You can simply select each head name and try to figure out the details about the users who have been uh, identified in that particular category. You can either integrate it with other Microsoft services, or you can integrate it with SIM solutions, different types of logging and monitoring SIM solutions, in order to make sure that all your events are being recorded at one single dashboard. This is if you are not using the Microsoft Cloud Application Security for identifying the anomalies inside your environment. Improved risk assessment and policies. You have options of taking administrators' feedback. You have machine learning improvements happening by every passing day, depending upon the kind of risks that are being detected in different environments or different customer directory tenants. And based on all those new detections, as I told you, the machine learning platform in the backend is just becoming stronger by every passing day. You have fundamentals like workbooks. Workbooks help you to identify uh, different aspects of your users and the devices that they are using. So typically identifying the device state, the device platform, client applications, kind of risks, and based on that, you can have these workbooks implement some automations so that each time there is a request which shows something compromising, that request can be automatically addressed without any manual intervention being required. Now, this is something really great when we talk about features that you have by default on the Azure platform. You can have password management to identify the detection of the leaked passwords. It can also help you to remediate these kind of password leaks, and set up a new policy to have that particular password changed, or have the password set up new, or have a multi-factor authentication in place, etc. And ultimately it will take you back to the same component called as conditional access, wherein you can define not to allow these kind of uh, password leaks inside your environment. Password management, as I told you, can be done using implementing password blocks. You can actually implement something called as enforcement of password change. As per the policy, after a few number of days or after a particular period that you don't want the user to use the same password, can be anything. You can have another best practice wherein your password protection for on-premise can also be taken care of by cloud when you actually switch your uh, technology aspect of on-premise to authenticate using OAuth. So when you will ask your authentication to happen using OAuth, all the typical components that you have are going to then start using the modern authentication methods, and you will have the logs of the same being generated inside your SIM solution or inside your Azure Active Directory. And then, in spite of having these passwords set as complex as they can, you can actually have these aspects changed by moving to the modern methods of using biometric, using fingerprints, iris scanners, using your Microsoft Authenticator app, etc. Multiple instances that will force you to use the modern authentication methods. That is the reason why at the first place you need to enable something called as the multi-factor authentication service. Once you enable that, you are actually preventing your organization to the best possible from being attacked. Strong credential management is something again which is going to be required. So it is better to not have calls and SMS when it comes to the multi-factor authentication. We should be using methods of having a verification token from my mobile device, from my mobile authenticator application, or just a push notification that we can put in place. We need to understand the risks, and for your better understanding, push notifications are the ones which comparatively have the least risk when you see the number of options that it provides you to manage your environment. Again, MFA is going to help you to protect your environment to the maximum possible using the modern authentication method. So when I say MFA, doesn't mean that you have to implement MFA on call or SMS. To have a better practice, you need to make sure that you are enabling it completely based on push notifications only. Now, the next option, after identifying the anomalies, after the identifying the risks and everything, implementing MFA and stuff, the last step that you can take is going passwordless and making sure that the authentication is simply happening without you entering any kind of a or rather I can say you giving any kind of an input, simply having a token on your device and you're good to go. Going passwordless is the new normal. May you do it using Federation, or whether you do it using a simple sync with Azure Active Directory. Things are going to matter when it comes to the user experience. And when we talk about going passwordless, there can be no other secure but best experience that an end user can get. For going passwordless, you need to make sure of a couple of parameters which are going to be your best practices. And those best practices comprise of one major change, that is you need to synchronize your on-prem devices to the Azure Active Directory so that they are capable of understanding the modern authentication methods. So you need to configure devices to synchronize from your on-prem to the Azure Active Directory. Once they are listed over there in Azure Active Directory, it will then become absolutely easy to manage the devices to accept a specific kind of an authentication only. Again, conditional access doesn't stay behind. It also can be used at device level, not only at the identity level. So if you have that kind of a configuration done, then in that case, you can simply enable conditional access on the users and the devices, and your data will not be accessed on any other device or on any other platform apart from the ones that you have permitted. They will help you to identify every single type of a user risk because conditional access has its own reporting algorithm. And then lastly, you have monitoring, which you can implement inside your environment using Azure Active Directory logs that are being generated, or identifying the risky users, identifying the risky sign-ins done by user or anonymous IP addresses used by the user, etc. Every single thing that I'm talking about over here comes as a part of your Azure Active Directory, but definitely the licensing does matter. The type of licensing that you might have, the features will vary accordingly. So coming back to the same component, it is absolutely important when it comes to identity and access management to implement the, you can say, the primary layer of a passwordless environment by configuring Windows Hello for Business. Of course, your device needs to be compatible for that. Microsoft Authenticator app for all my corporate data. And lastly, a security key based token in order to make sure that you have a second layer of security, a hardware layer of security for those kind of applications and files. So this brings us to an end of understanding the fundamental basics of identity and access management with Microsoft Azure. There is still a lot to speak on this, trust me guys, because there are a lot of additional features as well. But for the timing, we stop here, not to give you too much on your plate at once. You can just leave your comments to the coordinating team from Redington, from where you received the invite, and then we will be able to drive it for you.